They vanished without a trace. One by one, what was meant to be a sanctuary became an invisible grave. Built in 1842 in a remote region of Essex, St. Bartholomew's Orphanage was founded to shelter abandoned children. But from the very beginning, something felt wrong. Official records listed more children than anyone ever saw. Some simply disappeared. When questioned, the director claimed they'd been adopted by distant families. Not a single adoption was ever confirmed. Years later, during renovations, the truth surfaced. Shallow graves beneath the floorboards, small bones wrapped in religious cloths. The reason? Still unknown. But locals whisper a chilling theory. Someone inside believed the children were cursed, and that death was the only way to cleanse their souls. Today, the orphanage stands in ruins, and those who pass by at night still hear small footsteps behind them. Always behind, but never in sight. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life horror and chilling mysteries. And tell us in the comments, do you believe someone inside truly thought they were saving those children, or was it just evil hiding behind faith? The year was 1842, and the Industrial Revolution had left its mark on England's countryside. Smoke-stained cities overflowed with orphaned children, their parents claimed by disease, factory accidents, or simple poverty. It was into this darkness that the Order of St. Bartholomew stepped forward, promising salvation. Brother Marcus Whitmore arrived in Essex on a particularly bitter October morning. The wind cut through the bare branches of ancient oaks, carrying with it the scent of decay from nearby marshlands. He stood before an imposing Gothic structure, its dark stone walls rising like a fortress against the gray sky. The building had been a manor house once, belonging to a merchant family that had mysteriously vanished decades earlier. Now it would serve a holy purpose. God's work, Brother Marcus whispered to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. We shall give these lost souls a home. The transformation began immediately. Crosses were mounted on every wall. Religious texts filled the library, and prayers echoed through corridors that had once hosted lavish parties. The order spared no expense in their mission of mercy. By December, the first children arrived. They came in covered wagons, silent and hollow-eyed. Most were between 5 and 12 years old, brought from London's overcrowded workhouses and the disease-ridden streets of industrial towns. The older children carried the younger ones, their small hands clutching tattered dolls or pieces of bread saved from their last meal. Emma Hartwell was among the first. At 7 years old, she had already witnessed more death than most adults. Her parents had succumbed to cholera in the tenements of Whitechapel, and she had survived 3 months on the streets before being collected by the order's agents. She arrived at St. Bartholomew's with nothing but the clothes on her back and eyes that seemed far too old for her small face. "Welcome, child," Brother Marcus said, his voice gentle as he knelt before her. "You are safe now. You are home." The initial months seemed to confirm this promise. The children were fed regularly, clothed in clean uniforms, and given basic education. Morning prayers were followed by lessons in reading and arithmetic. Afternoons brought supervised play in the courtyard, where their laughter occasionally broke through perpetual gloom that seemed to hang over the building like a shroud. But even in those early days, there were signs that something was amiss. The first indication came from Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the wife of a local magistrate who had made charitable visits to the orphanage. She was a meticulous woman, known for her attention to detail and her genuine care for the less fortunate. During her visits, she would often count the children, noting their names and ages in a small leather journal she carried. "Brother Marcus," she said during one of her visits in the spring of 1843, "I seem to have a discrepancy in my records. Last month, I noted 37 children in residence. Today, I count only 32. Brother Marcus barely looked up from his prayer book. "Ah, Mrs. Blackwood, blessed news indeed. 5 of our dear children have found loving homes. The Pemberton family from Yorkshire took 2 brothers, and the Ashford from Canterbury have welcomed 3 sisters. God's providence at work." Mrs. Blackwood frowned, her pen hovering over her journal. "How wonderful. Might I have their names for my records? I do like to keep track of the children's welfare." Of course, Brother Marcus replied, but his response was vague. filled with generic surnames and distant locations. When Mrs. Black would press for more specific details, he would deflect with discussions of confidentiality and the privacy of the adopting families. The pattern continued. Children would disappear, always in small groups, always with the same explanation. Adoptions, loving families, new beginnings. But no letters ever came back from these supposedly happy children. No former residents ever returned to visit, as sometimes happened at other institutions. Dr. James Thornfield, the local physician who made monthly visits to check on the children's health, began to notice the irregularities as well. A careful man in his 50s, he kept detailed medical records of each child, noting their conditions, treatments, and progress. Brother Marcus, he said during a visit in the autumn of 1843, "I've been reviewing my records. Young Timothy Fletcher, whom I treated for consumption last month, you mentioned he was adopted by a family in Wales. However, the boy's condition was quite severe. I find it difficult to believe any family would take on a child requiring such intensive medical care." Brother Marcus's smile never wavered. "Faith, doctor. Faith can heal where medicine cannot. Perhaps the boy's condition improved more than we realized." Dr. Thornfield left that day with a troubling feeling in his chest. He had seen consumption claim many lives, and Timothy Fletcher had been gravely ill. The idea that he had recovered enough to be adopted seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. The villagers of Little Wickham, the nearest settlement to the orphanage, began to whisper among themselves. Market-day conversations carried fragments of concern. Mrs. Cromwell, who sold eggs and butter, mentioned that her daughter worked as a seamstress in Canterbury and had never heard of any Ashford family adopting 3 sisters. Mr. Jennings, a blacksmith, knew every family in Yorkshire through his trade connections, and no Pembertons had ever mentioned taking in orphan boys. The children themselves seemed to sense something was wrong. Those who remained at St. Bartholomew's grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn. They would huddle together during meals, speaking in whispers that stopped the moment an adult approached. Play became subdued, and the laughter that had once echoed through the courtyard became increasingly rare. Emma Hartwell, now 8 years old and one of the longer-term residents, began to have nightmares. She would wake in the middle of the night, crying out for friends who were no longer there. When asked about her dreams, she would shake her head and refuse to speak. But other children began to report similar experiences, dreams of their missing companions calling out from somewhere dark and cold. The staff at St. Bartholomew's consisted of Brother Marcus, 2 junior brothers from the order, and several local women who served as cooks and cleaners. These women, particularly Mrs. Sarah Millhouse, the head cook, began to notice troubling patterns as well. "It's not natural," Mrs. Millhouse confided to her sister during one of their evening walks. "Children don't just vanish like that. And the way Brother Marcus talks about these adoptions, it's as if he's reciting a script. The same words, the same explanations, over and over." The meals at St. Bartholomew's were another source of concern. Mrs. Millhouse prepared food for the number of children on the official registry, but she consistently found herself with surplus portions. When she mentioned this to Brother Marcus, he would simply say that the children had eaten well, and that leftovers were a blessing to be shared with the poor. But Mrs. Millhouse knew the poor of Little Wickham, and none of them reported receiving food from the orphanage. The surplus meals simply disappeared, like the children themselves. As 1844 dawned, the orphanage's reputation in the local community began to shift. What had once been seen as a beacon of hope and Christian charity was now viewed with suspicion and unease. Parents in surrounding villages began to keep their children closer to home, and stories of St. Bartholomew's were shared in hushed tones around evening fires. The building itself seemed to reflect this growing darkness. The Gothic architecture that had once appeared majestic now seemed menacing. The stone gargoyles that adorned the corners of the roof seemed to leer down at passers-by with malevolent grins. The windows, many of them now showing cracks and where resembled hollow eyes staring out from a skull. Even the weather seemed to conspire against the orphanage. Fog rolled in from the marshlands more frequently, wrapping the building in a gray shroud that made it appear to fade in and out of existence. Rain fell more heavily here than in the surrounding areas, as if the very sky wept for the children within. Brother Marcus continued his work, seemingly oblivious to the growing concerns around him. He maintained his gentle demeanor with the children, his pious conversations with visitors, and his detailed correspondence with the church hierarchy. But those who looked closely could see changes in him as well. His eyes, once warm and kindly, had taken on a distant quality. His prayers became longer and more fervent, and he could often be found in the chapel at all hours, kneeling before the altar with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The children who remained at St. Bartholomew's adapted as children do, finding ways to survive in an environment that grew more frightening with each passing day. They learned to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention to themselves, to never ask questions about their missing friends. Emma Hartwell, now one of the oldest residents, became a protector of the younger children. She would tell them stories to help them sleep, share food when others seemed hungry, and always remind them to be good, because being good meant staying, and staying meant living another day. But even Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for all of them, something that lurked in the shadows of St. Bartholomew's, patient and hungry, watching from the darkness with eyes that never blinked. The foundation of shadows had been laid, and upon it, a horror beyond imagination was about to be built. By the winter of 1845, a sinister rhythm had established itself at St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. Like the ticking of a cursed clock, children vanished with disturbing regularity, always during the darkest hours of night, always without warning, always leaving behind only empty beds and unanswered questions. Emma Hartwell, now 10 years old, had become an unwilling keeper of memories. She remembered every face, every name, every small detail about the friends who had simply ceased to exist. There was little Thomas Ashby, who had carved wooden animals with a broken knife he'd hidden under his mattress. Mary Sinclair, who hummed lullabies her dead mother had sung to her. Peter Whitlock, who could make the other children laugh even when the gruel was cold and the nights were long. All gone, all adopted, according to Brother Marcus. The pattern was always the same. A child would be there at evening prayers, their small voice joining the others in reciting the Lord's Prayer. By morning, their bed would be empty, their few possessions vanished, and Brother Marcus would announce the blessed news of another successful adoption. "God has smiled upon young Sarah," he would say, his voice carrying that same rehearsed cadence that had become all too familiar. "A loving family from the north has welcomed her into their hearts. Let us pray for her happiness." But the children had learned to read the signs. They noticed that those who disappeared were often the ones who had been asking questions, or showing signs of illness, or displaying behavior that Brother Marcus deemed troubling. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone who cared to look. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood had not only been looking, she had been documenting. Her small leather journal had grown thick with notes, names, and discrepancies. By 1846, her records painted a picture so disturbing that she could no longer ignore it. 43 children, she muttered to herself as she sat in her drawing room, surrounded by papers and calculations. 43 children have supposedly been adopted in the past 3 years. Yet I have not received a single letter, not one word of gratitude from any adopting family. Her husband, Magistrate William Blackwood, looked up from his evening paper. "Perhaps gratitude is not as common as we might hope, my dear." "William," Eleanor said, her voice tight with barely contained emotion, "I have visited dozens of orphanages throughout England. Adopting families always express gratitude. They send letters, they make donations, they sometimes even return a visit. This silence is unnatural." She had tried to investigate further, sending inquiries to parishes in the towns where these adoptions had supposedly taken place. The responses, when they came at all, were universally the same. No record of any such families, no knowledge of any recent adoptions, no trace of the children who had supposedly found new homes. Dr. James Thornfield had reached similar conclusions through his medical records. His leather-bound journal contained detailed notes about each child's health, and the pattern of disappearances troubled him deeply. "The sickest children always seem to be the first to go," he confided to his wife during one of their evening walks. Young Margaret Fielding, who was suffering from a wasting disease. Timothy Fletcher, with his consumption. Little David Morse, who had developed a persistent cough. It's as if someone is selecting them. His wife stopped walking, her face pale in the moonlight. "James, what are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure," he replied, but his voice carried a weight of terrible understanding. "But healthy children are easier placed in loving homes. Why would families consistently choose the sickest, most troubled children?" The mystery deepened when Dr. Thornfield attempted to follow up on his former patients. He had contacts throughout the medical community, and he began making discreet inquiries about children matching the descriptions of his missing patients. If they had truly been adopted, they would likely need continued medical care. The responses were uniformly negative. No physicians in Yorkshire had treated two brothers matching the description of the Pemberton adoptions. No doctors in Canterbury had seen three sisters with the distinctive auburn hair of the supposed Ashford adoptions. It was as if these children had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Inside St. Bartholomew's, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. The remaining children moved through their daily routines like ghosts, their eyes constantly darting toward the empty beds that were quickly filled by new arrivals. The cycle continued with mechanical precision. New children arrived, settled into the routine, and then began to disappear. Emma Hartwell had developed a grim expertise in reading the signs. She could predict with chilling accuracy which children would vanish next. It was always those who stood out in some way, the ones who cried too much, asked too many questions, or showed signs of illness. But increasingly, she noticed another pattern. The children who disappeared were often those who had begun to remember. "Do you remember your mama?" 7-year-old Lucy Porter had asked Emma one evening as they sat by the dormitory window. "I dreamed about mine last night. She was calling for me, but I couldn't find her." 3 days later, Lucy was gone. Adopted by a lovely family in Devon, Brother Marcus announced. They specifically requested a child with Lucy's sweet nature. The staff at St. Bartholomew's had begun to show signs of strain as well. Mrs. Sarah Millhouse, the head cook, had grown increasingly nervous and withdrawn. She would jump at unexpected sounds, drop dishes when startled, and often stare into the distance with haunted eyes. "It's not right," she whispered to her assistant, young Mary Hartwell. No relation to Emma despite sharing the surname. "I cook for 50 children most nights, but I never see more than 30 at meals. When I ask about the others, Brother Marcus says they're ill or being punished or praying in the chapel, but I never see them there either." Mary Hartwell had her own concerns. As the newest member of the staff, she had been assigned to help with laundry and cleaning duties. It was during these tasks that she made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "The clothes," she told Mrs. Millhouse one evening as they worked in the kitchen. "When children are adopted, they should take their belongings with them. But I keep finding clothes in the storage rooms, little jackets, worn shoes, even toys. Why would adopted children leave everything behind?" Mrs. Millhouse stopped stirring the pot she was tending. "What kind of toys?" "A wooden horse that belonged to Peter Whitlock, Sarah Fletcher's rag doll, Thomas Ashby's carved animals." Mary's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're all locked away in the cellar storage room. Dozens of them. Little piles of belongings, like they're waiting for their owners to come back." The two women stared at each other in horror, the implications settling over them like a shroud. Brother Marcus, meanwhile, seemed increasingly consumed by his religious duties. His prayers had become longer and more fervent, often lasting well into the night. The other brothers in the order had begun to notice his changed behavior, but they attributed it to his deep commitment to his holy work. Brother Marcus has been blessed with divine purpose. Brother Anthony, the younger of the two junior brothers, told a visiting priest. His dedication to these lost souls is truly inspiring. He often spends entire nights in prayer, seeking guidance for the children in his care. But those who looked closely could see disturbing changes in Brother Marcus. His eyes had taken on a fevered quality, and he would often mutter to himself in Latin during his daily rounds. The children had learned to avoid him when he was in these moods, sensing something dangerous in his increasing intensity. Emma Hartwell, now one of the longest surviving residents, had become a student of survival. She taught the newer children the unwritten rules of St. Bartholomew's, never asked about the missing children, never complained about food or conditions, never show signs of illness, and above all, never, ever question Brother Marcus's explanations. "Be invisible," she would whisper to the younger ones. "Be good, be quiet, and maybe you'll live to see another day." The local community's suspicions had grown into active concern. Mrs. Blackwood had begun sharing her findings with other prominent families in the area, and word was spreading about the strange happenings at St. Bartholomew's. Market-day conversations now included hushed discussions about the orphanage, and parents kept their children closer to home. Mr. Henry Jameson, the local undertaker, had his own observations to share. "It's peculiar," he told his wife. "For an institution housing so many children, I've never been called to St. Bartholomew's. Not once. Children die. It's a sad fact of life, especially poor children in institutions. But in 4 years, not a single funeral? It's unusual." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture too horrible to contemplate. Children were disappearing, their belongings left behind, their supposed adoptions unverifiable. The pattern was consistent, methodical, and increasingly frequent. As 1847 approached, the whispers in Little Wickham grew louder. Something was terribly wrong at St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, and the terrible truth was beginning to emerge in the shadows where it had been hiding. The children who remained lived in constant fear, never knowing when their turn might come. They had learned to sleep with one eye open, to trust no one completely, and to pray to a God who seemed to have abandoned them in this place of supposed sanctuary. Emma Hartwell, now 11 years old and wise beyond her years, understood that she was living on borrowed time. She had survived longer than most, but she could feel the weight of attention beginning to focus on her. She was asking too many questions, remembering too much, and worst of all, she was beginning to understand. The pattern of disappearance had become clear. The only question that remained was, what was really happening to the children of St. Bartholomew's? The answer to that question lay hidden in the shadows of the orphanage, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look. But for now, the children could only wait and hope and pray that they would not be chosen next. The darkness was growing deeper, and the true horror was yet to be revealed. The autumn of 1887 brought unexpected change to St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. After 45 years under Brother Marcus's increasingly iron grip, the church hierarchy had finally decided to send a replacement. Father Michael O'Sullivan arrived on a rain-soaked October morning, his black cassock dripping with English mist as he stood before the Gothic entrance of what would become his new home. At 34, Father O'Sullivan was considered young for such a responsibility, but his reputation for compassion and administrative skill had preceded him. He had successfully managed 2 other institutions in Ireland, and the bishop had specifically chosen him to bring fresh perspective to the good work at St. Bartholomew's. What Father O'Sullivan found upon his arrival was far from the thriving Christian institution he had been led to expect. Brother Marcus, now in his 70s, had become a skeletal figure wrapped in black robes that seemed to hang on his diminished frame like funeral shrouds. His eyes, once described as gentle and kind, had taken on a fevered intensity that made children scatter from his path. His prayers had become rambling, desperate affairs that stretched for hours, filled with Latin phrases that even Father O'Sullivan, with his theological training, found disturbing. "Welcome, Father," Brother Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "You have come to do God's work among the cursed and the forsaken." The word cursed hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Father O'Sullivan noted it immediately, filing it away with the dozen other concerning observations he had already made in his first hour at St. Bartholomew's. The children themselves were perhaps the most troubling sight. Where Father O'Sullivan had expected to find the usual chaos and energy of young lives, he discovered instead a collection of shadows. The 23 children currently in residence moved through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of clockwork figures, their eyes downcast, their voices rarely rising above whispers. Emma Hartwell, now 22 years old and one of the few who had somehow survived to adulthood, worked as an unofficial assistant to the staff. She had never been adopted, never been chosen for whatever fate had claimed so many others. Instead, she had aged into a position of fragile safety, too old to be of interest to Brother Marcus's mysterious selection process. "Father O'Sullivan," she said during their first meeting, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had learned to speak only when necessary. "I hope your stay here brings you peace." But her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, and expected nothing good from the world. Father O'Sullivan began his investigation immediately, though he did not call it that. He simply asked questions, the kind of questions any competent administrator would ask when taking over a new institution. The answers he received were uniformly disturbing. "The records, Brother Marcus," he said during their first formal meeting. "I've been reviewing the ledgers, and I'm having difficulty reconciling the numbers. Over the past 5 years, you recorded 127 adoptions, yet the income from adoption fees seems inconsistent." Brother Marcus barely looked up from his prayer book. "God's work is not measured in earthly currency, Father. The joy of placing a child in a loving home is reward enough." "Of course, but the church requires proper documentation. Surely you have correspondence from these adopting families? References? Follow-up reports?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Brother Marcus spoke, his voice carrying a strange, dreamy quality. "The children who leave us are cleansed. They have no need to look back upon this place of trial and purification." That night, Father O'Sullivan wrote his first letter to Bishop Aldrich. "My Lord Bishop, I write to you on my 3rd day at St. Bartholomew's with concerns that I hope will prove unfounded. The record-keeping here is, to put it charitably, irregular. Brother Marcus speaks of adoptions in terms that seem unusual. I have found no correspondence from adopting families, no references checked, no follow-up conducted. The children here seem unusually subdued, almost fearful. I intend to investigate further, but I felt you should be made aware of these initial observations. Your servant in Christ, Father Michael O'Sullivan." The investigation that followed revealed horrors beyond Father O'Sullivan's imagination. The financial records were a maze of inconsistencies. Money designated for children's care had been diverted to strange purchases. Large quantities of lime, unusual tools, and religious texts focused on purification rituals that had no place in conventional Christian doctrine. The most disturbing discovery came when Father O'Sullivan decided to explore the eastern wing of the building. This section had been declared unsafe by Brother Marcus, its doors locked and its windows boarded up. But Father O'Sullivan had noticed something troubling. The eastern wing showed no signs of structural damage, yet was completely off-limits to staff and children alike. On his 5th night at St. Bartholomew's, Father O'Sullivan waited until the building was silent, then made his way to the eastern wing with a set of keys he found in Brother Marcus's desk. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The eastern wing was not abandoned. It was in use, but not for any purpose that belonged in a house of God. The rooms had been converted into something that resembled a combination of mortuary and chapel. Stone slabs dominated the center of each room, stained with substances that Father O'Sullivan preferred not to identify. The walls were covered with religious texts, but these were not the familiar passages of comfort and hope. These were Old Testament verses about purification through fire, about cleansing the unclean, about the necessity of sacrifice. The smell that permeated the eastern wing was indescribable. It was the smell of death, but something more. The smell of death that had been ritualized, sanctified, made into something holy in the twisted mind of someone who believed he was doing God's work. Father O'Sullivan's second letter to Bishop Aldrich was written in a hand that shook with horror. "My Lord Bishop, I must report findings that fill me with such revulsion that I can barely put pen to paper. The eastern wing of St. Bartholomew's has been converted into what I can only describe as a ritual chamber. The evidence suggests that children have been... I cannot write it. I cannot put such horror into words. Brother Marcus has lost his mind, but he believes he is saving souls. He speaks of cleansing and purification in ways that violate every principle of Christian mercy. I fear that the children who have supposedly been adopted have met a fate too terrible to contemplate. I am gathering evidence, but I fear for my safety. Brother Marcus watches me constantly, and I sense that he knows I have discovered his secrets. I request immediate assistance and investigation. Your servant in Christ. Father Michael O'Sullivan." The nights at St. Bartholomew's became a waking nightmare for Father O'Sullivan. He would lie in his bed, listen to sounds that had no place in an orphanage, footsteps in empty corridors, the sound of digging from somewhere beneath the building. Most disturbing of all, the sound of children's voices, not the voices of the living children, but whispers and cries that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Do you hear them too?" Emma Hartwell asked him one evening as they passed in the corridor. "Hear what, my child?" "The voices. The children who are no longer here. They call out at night, especially when the wind is strong. They're trying to tell us something." Father O'Sullivan stared at her, seeing in her weathered face the accumulated horror of decades. "What do you think they're trying to say?" "That they're still here," Emma whispered. "That they never left. That they're waiting for someone to find them." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. The missing children had never been adopted. They had been murdered by Brother Marcus in his twisted belief that he was saving their souls. But where were the bodies? St. Bartholomew's sat on several acres of land, much of it unexplored. Father O'Sullivan began making careful explorations of the grounds, always watching for Brother Marcus's increasingly suspicious behavior. He found disturbed earth in several locations, areas where the grass grew differently, where the ground seemed to have been dug up and refilled. His third letter to Bishop Aldrich was his most urgent. "My Lord Bishop, I write to you in desperation. Brother Marcus has begun to watch me constantly, and I fear that he suspects I have discovered his horrible secret. The children here are not being adopted. They are being murdered in the name of religious purification. I have found what I believe to be burial sites on the grounds. I implore you to send help immediately. I fear not only for my own safety, but for the children who remain. Brother Marcus has begun to speak of final cleansing and completing God's work. I believe he intends to murder all the remaining children before his crimes can be exposed. I have hidden copies of all evidence in a location known only to myself. If something happens to me, please ensure that this investigation continues. These children deserve justice, and Brother Marcus must be stopped. Your servant in Christ, Father Michael O'Sullivan." The letter was never sent. Father O'Sullivan disappeared on his 15th night at St. Bartholomew's. Brother Marcus announced the next morning that the young priest had been called away on urgent church business, but the staff who had grown to trust Father O'Sullivan knew better. Emma Hartwell found his packed belongings in the storage room, hidden beneath old blankets and children's clothes. She also found something else, a letter journal filled with his observations, his horror, and his growing understanding of the truth about St. Bartholomew's. The journal contained detailed maps of the grounds, marking locations where Father O'Sullivan believed bodies might be buried. It contained transcript of conversations with Brother Marcus, revealing the depth of his madness and his absolute conviction that he was doing God's work by cleansing the children in his care. Most chilling of all, the journal contained a list of names, all the children who had supposedly been adopted over the years. Next to each name, Father O'Sullivan had written a single word: murdered. The journal disappeared from the church archives within days of Father O'Sullivan's transfer, according to official records. But Emma Hartwell had read it, memorized it, and understood that she was living in a house of horrors that masqueraded as a house of God. Brother Marcus returned to his routine as if nothing had happened, but those who knew him could see the changes. His prayers had become even more fervent, his behavior more erratic. He had begun to speak openly of completing the work and final purification. The children who remained at St. Bartholomew's lived in constant terror, knowing that their turn was coming. They had learned to sleep with their eyes open, to trust no one, and to pray to a God who seemed to have abandoned them in this place of unspeakable evil. Emma Hartwell, now the unofficial guardian of the orphanage's terrible secrets, made a decision that would either save the remaining children or doom them all. She would find a way to expose Brother Marcus's crimes, even if it cost her life. The truth about St. Bartholomew's was finally beginning to emerge in the shadows, but the cost of that truth will be measured in blood and terror. The final act of this horrific drama was about to begin, and no one could predict who would survive to tell the tale. The year 1891 brought an end to the nightmare, but not to the horror. Emma Hartwell's testimony to the authorities had finally achieved what 49 years of whispered suspicions could not. At 26, She had become the sole witness to decades of atrocity, her words carrying the weight of every murdered child whose voice had been silenced forever. The investigation that followed was swift and damning. Inspector Charles Whitmore arrived from London with a team of constables and immediately ordered the excavation of St. Bartholomew's grounds. What they found beneath the eastern wing and scattered across the property shocked even hardened investigators. 37 small graves. Shallow, hastily dug, each containing the remains of a child wrapped in torn religious cloth. The body showed signs of ritualistic preparation, hands folded in prayer, crude crosses carved into makeshift wooden markers, Latin phrases sewn into the burial shrouds. Brother Marcus was found in the chapel, kneeling before the altar in a state of catatonic prayer. When arrested, he showed no resistance, no awareness of his surroundings. He simply continued to mutter verses about purification and salvation until the very moment the asylum doors closed behind him. He believed he was saving them. Inspector Whitmore wrote in his final report, "In his twisted mind, these children were cursed souls that could only find peace through death. He saw himself as an instrument of divine mercy." St. Bartholomew's Orphanage officially closed its doors on November 15, 1891. The surviving children were relocated to other institutions, and the building was sealed by order of the church. But sealing the doors could not contain what had been awakened within those walls. The first reports came within weeks of the closure. Mrs. Margaret Thornfield, widow of the late Dr. James Thornfield, was returning from evening services when she noticed lights flickering in the windows of the abandoned orphanage. Impossible lights, since the gas had been disconnected and the building stood empty. They moved from room to room, she told her neighbor, Mrs. Cromwell, like little candles being carried by invisible hands. And I could swear I heard singing, children's voices singing hymns in the darkness. Similar reports began to accumulate throughout the winter. Travelers on the road past St. Bartholomew's spoke of seeing small figures in the windows, always at twilight, always disappearing when looked at directly. The local postman refused to deliver mail to nearby houses after dark, claiming he could hear children calling his name from inside the sealed building. Young Timothy Ashford, the blacksmith's son, made the mistake of accepting a dare from his schoolmates. On a bitter February night in 1892, he climbed through a broken window in the cellar and spent 20 minutes inside St. Bartholomew's. He emerged screaming and never spoke coherently again. "The boy keeps drawing the same thing," his mother told Dr. Harrison, the new physician who had replaced Dr. Thornfield. "Tiny hands reaching up from floorboards. And he writes the same words over and over. They want to go home." Timothy was sent to an asylum in London, where he died 3 months later, still drawing those reaching hands until the very end. The phenomena intensified as the seasons changed. Spring brought new horrors that tested the sanity of everyone in Little Wickham. Children playing near the orphanage reported hearing their names called from empty rooms. Adults walking past at dusk claimed to see small faces press against windows, eyes pleading for help that would never come. Most disturbing were the sounds that echoed from within the building during the darkest hours of night. Not just children's voices, but the sound of footsteps running through corridors, doors slamming, and occasionally a man's voice raised in fervent prayer. Brother Marcus had died in the asylum 6 months after his arrest, but whatever had driven him to madness seemed to have taken up permanent residence at St. Bartholomew's. Emma Hartwell, now working as a seamstress in Canterbury, returned to Little Wickham only once after the orphanage's closure. She came to visit a memorial that had been erected for the murdered children, a simple stone cross bearing 37 names carved in weathered granite. She found more than a memorial waiting for her. As she knelt before the cross, reading names she remembered as living, breathing children, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Laughter, the high, innocent laughter of children at play, echoing from the direction of the abandoned orphanage. She turned toward the building and saw them, dozens of small figures gathered in the courtyard, where children had once played under the watchful eye of death. They were translucent, like morning mist given human form, but she recognized every face. Peter Whitlock, still carrying his carved wooden animals. Mary Sinclair, her auburn hair catching light that had no source. Little Lucy Porter, the girl who had asked about her mama. They were all there, all the children who had been adopted into the grave, and they were looking at her with eyes full of longing and unfinished business. Emma tried to speak, to call out to them, but no sound emerged from her throat. The children began to move closer, their small hands reaching toward her, their mouths opening as if to speak. But before any words could be formed, they began to fade, becoming wisps of gray mist that dissolved into the evening air. Emma never returned to Little Wickham. She moved to Scotland, married a shopkeeper, and tried to build a life far from the shadows of St. Bartholomew's. But even there, she would sometimes wake in the night, certain she could hear children's voices calling her name. The orphanage building began to deteriorate rapidly after 1892. Windows cracked without cause, roof tiles fell during windless nights, and the stone walls developed strange dark stains that seemed to spread like infected wounds. The church made several attempts to sell the property, but every potential buyer fled after spending a single night on the grounds. Local children created increasingly elaborate dares involving the haunted orphanage. Most were content to throw stones at windows or shout challenges at the empty building, but some were brave enough or foolish enough to venture inside. None of them returned unchanged. Sarah Wellington, age 12, entered through the same cellar window Timothy Ashford had used. She emerged 3 hours later, her hair turned completely white, and her eyes fixed on something only she could see. She spent the rest of her life drawing maps of underground tunnels that didn't exist, always insisting that the children are still down there, waiting for someone to help them dig out. Michael Harrison, the doctor's 13-year-old nephew, made it as far as the main dormitory before running back outside in terror. He claimed he had seen dozens of small beds, all of them occupied by sleeping children who opened their eyes and stared at him in perfect, horrible unison. They looked so sad, he told his uncle, like they'd been waiting forever for someone to tuck them in and tell them everything would be all right. The most detailed account came from Rebecca Ashby, a 16-year-old girl whose younger brother Thomas had been one of Brother Marcus's victims. Driven by grief and desperate for closure, she spent an entire night inside St. Bartholomew's in the summer of 1895. Her written testimony, found in her bedroom after she hanged herself 3 days later, provided the most complete description of the supernatural phenomena plaguing the abandoned orphanage. The children are everywhere. They walk the corridors at night, looking for beds that no longer exist. They gather in the dormitories, sitting on the floor where their beds once stood, waiting for morning prayers that will never come. They remember everything. They remember being cold and hungry. They remember being afraid. Most of all, they remember the man in black robes who told them he was sending them to heaven. They show me things. They take my hands with their cold, small fingers and lead me to places where their bodies were hidden before being moved to the graves outside. The eastern wing still smells of death and lime. The basement still echoes with their cries. They don't understand why they can't leave. They don't understand why their parents never came for them. They just want to go home. I told them I would help them find peace, but I don't know how. Some sins are too great to be forgiven, some wounds too deep to heal. These children are trapped here by the horror of their deaths, and I fear they will remain trapped forever. I cannot bear to leave them, but I cannot bear to stay. May God forgive me for what I am about to do. Rebecca's suicide marked the beginning of the end for any human contact with St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. The local authorities finally erected a fence around the property and posted warnings to keep trespassers away. But no fence could contain the horror that had taken root in that cursed ground. As the 19th century drew to a close, St. Bartholomew's had become a legend of terror throughout Essex and beyond. Ghost hunters and spiritualists made pilgrimages to the site, but few lasted more than an hour within the building's crumbling walls. The children were still there, still waiting, still hoping for someone to lead them home. Their voices could be heard on quiet nights, carried on the wind across the marshlands, the sound of innocence destroyed, of trust betrayed, of souls too young to understand the evil that had claimed them. The orphanage stood as a monument to humanity's capacity for horror disguised as righteousness. Within its walls, Brother Marcus had created a hell on earth in the name of salvation, and the consequences of his madness would echo through the decades to come. The children of St. Bartholomew's had found no peace in death. They remained trapped in the place where their lives had ended, forever seeking the love and safety they had been promised but never received. Their story was far from over. 73 years after the last child disappeared from St. Bartholomew's Orphanage, the truth would finally emerge from its shallow grave. The year was 1964, and progress had finally reached the remote corners of Essex. The Pembroke Development Company had purchased the abandoned orphanage property with plans to construct a modern housing estate. The Gothic building, now a crumbling shell of blackened stone and broken windows, was scheduled for demolition. Construction foreman James Mitchell arrived on a gray September morning with his crew of 12 men, none of whom had any knowledge of the property's dark history. To them, it was simply another old building to be torn down and forgotten. "Ugly old place," commented Robert Hayes, the demolition supervisor, as he surveyed the orphanage's deteriorated facade. "Looks like it's been abandoned for decades." If only they had known it had been abandoned for good reason. The first day of work proceeded normally. The crew focused on clearing debris from the main building, preparing for the controlled demolition that would bring down the structure. It was during this initial cleanup that they made their first disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris in the basement, they found a collection of personal belongings that had somehow survived the passage of time. Rotted clothing, broken toys, and most unsettling of all, dozens of small shoes. Children's shoes in various sizes and states of decay. "Strange place for a lost and found," joked crew member Paul Stevens, but his laughter died in his throat when he realized the implications. These weren't belongings that had been accidentally left behind. They were the remnants of lives that had been deliberately erased. The real horror began on the third day, when the crew started excavating the foundation of the eastern wing. 2 feet below the concrete floor, Mitchell's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or earth, something that cracked with a sound like breaking chalk. When he brushed away the dirt, he found himself staring into the empty eye sockets of a human skull, a child's skull. "Stop everything," Mitchell ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody moves until we figure out what we're dealing with here." The police arrived within hours, followed by forensic experts from London and representatives from the church. What they uncovered over the following weeks would shock the nation and reopen wounds that had never properly healed. The basement of the eastern wing contained the remains of 17 children, buried in shallow graves beneath what had once been the orphanage's purification chamber. These were not the same graves that had been discovered in 1891. These were older, deeper, and showed signs of ritualistic preparation that made even experienced investigators sick to their stomachs. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, no relation to Emma despite the shared surname, led the forensic investigation. Her preliminary report painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as religious ceremony. "The remains show evidence of ritualistic preparation," she wrote. Each body was carefully positioned, hands folded in prayer, wrapped in religious cloth inscribed with Latin phrases related to purification and salvation. The killer believed he was performing a sacred duty. But the basement graves were only the beginning. As the excavation expanded, more bodies were found throughout the property. Under the chapel floor, they discovered the remains of 23 children arranged in concentric circles around a crude stone altar. In the orphanage garden, 8 more graves were uncovered, each marked with a handmade wooden cross bearing the inscription, "Purified in Christ's love." The final count was staggering. 67 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, all murdered over the course of nearly 50 years. Inspector David Crawford, leading the criminal investigation, found himself confronting a horror that defied comprehension. "We're not dealing with a simple case of murder," he told reporters. This was systematic, ritualistic killing carried out over decades by someone who believed he was doing God's work. The investigation also revealed the true fate of Father Michael O'Sullivan. His remains were found in a sealed chamber beneath the chapel, his body positioned as if in prayer, a crude cross carved into his forehead. Documents found with his body included detailed records of Brother Marcus's crimes and evidence that the young priest had been murdered to prevent exposure of the truth. Among O'Sullivan's hidden papers was a journal that provided the most complete picture yet of Brother Marcus's twisted theology. The entries revealed a man who had gradually descended into madness, convinced that the children in his care were vessels of corruption that could only be saved through death. "The children arrived broken," one entry read. Abandoned by parents, rejected by society, tainted by the sin of their circumstances. But through purification, through the ultimate sacrifice, they can be cleansed. Death is not an ending for these lost souls. It is the beginning of their true salvation. The journal detailed Brother Marcus's elaborate selection process. He would observe the children for weeks, looking for signs of what he considered spiritual corruption, questioning authority, showing anger, or simply failing to display sufficient gratitude for his charity. Those who were chosen for purification were told they were being prepared for adoption by special families. The ritual itself was described in nauseating detail. Brother Marcus would lead the selected children to the Eastern Wing, where he would conduct a perverse ceremony that combined Christian prayers with his own twisted liturgy. He believed he was sending their souls directly to heaven while cleansing them of earthly sin. They go peacefully, he wrote. When they understand they're being saved, they submit willingly to God's plan. Their last breaths are prayers of gratitude. The discovery sent shockwaves through the church hierarchy. Archbishop William Thornfield, grandson of the doctor who had first suspected the truth, issued a statement acknowledging the institution's failure to investigate reports of irregularities at St. Bartholomew's. "We failed these children," he said at a press conference. "We failed to act on warnings, failed to investigate concerns, and failed to protect the innocent lives entrusted to our care. No words can express our grief and shame." But the physical evidence was only part of the horror that emerged from the ruins of St. Bartholomew's. The construction workers, police investigators, and forensic experts all reported experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Electronic equipment would malfunction without cause. Most disturbing of all, several workers reported hearing children's voices coming from empty rooms, always just at the edge of perception, always carrying the same message: "Help us go home." Construction foreman James Mitchell experienced the most dramatic encounter. Working late one evening to secure the site, he found himself face to face with a small figure in the basement where the bodies had been discovered. It was a boy, maybe 8 years old, he told investigators. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes, and he looked transparent, like I could see right through him. He didn't say anything, just pointed toward the wall where we'd found the bodies. Then he faded away like smoke. Mitchell quit the project the next day and never returned construction work. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, despite her scientific training, found herself forced to acknowledge that something beyond normal experience was occurring at St. Bartholomew's. "I've worked dozens of crime scenes," she wrote in her final report. "I've never experienced anything like this. There's a presence here, something that resists being disturbed. These children, I don't think they've found peace." The excavation was completed in November 1964, and all 67 sets of remains were given proper burial in consecrated ground at Little Wickham Cemetery. A memorial service was held, attended by hundreds of people from throughout Essex and beyond. The Archbishop himself delivered a eulogy, begging forgiveness for the church's failures and promising that such horrors would never be allowed to happen again. But promises could not undo the damage that had been done, or lay to rest the spirits that continue to haunt the cursed ground of St. Bartholomew's. The development company abandoned their plans for the housing estate. The property was donated to the church, which declared a memorial site that would never be built upon. A simple stone monument was erected on the spot where the orphanage had stood, bearing the names of all 67 victims and the inscription, "In memory of the innocent, never forgotten, forever at peace." The inscription proved to be wishful thinking. Even after the proper burial of the remains, the phenomena continued. Local residents reported seeing children playing in the empty field where the orphanage had stood, always at twilight, always disappearing when approached. The sound of footsteps could still be heard on quiet nights, along with a distant echo of children's voices singing hymns. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators made regular pilgrimages to the site, but few could tolerate more than a few hours there. The overwhelming sense of sadness and loss was too intense, too persistent. Some reported feeling small hands tugging at their clothes, while others claimed to hear whispered pleas for help. Emma Hartwell, now 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Scotland, was contacted by investigators during the 1964 excavation. Though her memory had begun to fail, She clearly remembered the children whose bodies had been found. They were never meant to die, she told Detective Inspector Crawford during their interview. They were just children who needed love and safety. Instead, they found a monster who convinced himself he was an angel of mercy. When asked about the paranormal reports, Emma's expression grew distant. They're still there because they never got to grow up, she said. They never got to go home. They're waiting for someone to love them the way they should have been loved when they were alive. Emma Hartwell died peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks after the interview at age 90. Her nurse reported that her last words were, "Tell them I'm coming home now. Tell them they can rest." But the children of St. Bartholomew's have never found rest. Today, more than 60 years after the excavation, the memorial site remains one of England's most documented paranormal locations. The phenomena have diminished, but never stopped entirely. Local residents have learned to live with the occasional sound of children's laughter carried on the wind, the glimpse of small figures running through the field at dusk, the sense of being watched by eyes full of innocent longing. The truth about St. Bartholomew's Orphanage stands as a reminder of humanity's capacity for evil disguised as righteousness. Brother Marcus believed he was saving souls while destroying lives. He convinced himself that murder was mercy, that death was deliverance. The children he killed deserved love, protection, and the chance to grow into the people they were meant to become. Instead, they found only madness wrapped in religious robes, death delivered with prayers on its lips. Their story serves as a warning that evil often wears the mask of virtue, and that the most dangerous monsters are those who believe their cruelty is kindness. The children of St. Bartholomew's wait still, in the space between life and death, hoping that someday someone will finally help them find their way home. The story of St. Bartholomew's Orphanage forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature, that the greatest evil often hides behind the mask of righteousness. Brother Marcus didn't see himself as a killer. He believed he was a savior, convinced that death was the only path to redemption for the children in his care. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't passion or anger. This was calculated, systematic murder carried out with the absolute certainty that it was God's will. For nearly 50 years, 67 innocent souls were sacrificed on the altar of one man's twisted faith, their only crime being born into circumstances beyond their control. What makes this story even more chilling is how easily it could have been prevented. The signs were there from the beginning. The suspicious adoption records, the missing children, the testimonies of concerned visitors. But authority protected authority, and religious institutions were considered beyond question. The children who survived, like Emma Hartwell, carried the weight of this horror for their entire lives. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear robes and speak of salvation while sharpening their knives. Today, St. Bartholomew stands as more than just a ghost story. It's a reminder that we must always question those who claim divine authority over others, especially the most vulnerable among us. It challenges us to listen when children speak of fear, to investigate when numbers don't add up, and to never assume that good intentions justify horrific actions. The voices that still echo across those empty fields aren't just the spirits of murdered children. They're the voices of every victim whose suffering was ignored, whose cries for help went unheard, whose trust was betrayed by those sworn to protect them. Some say you can still hear their footsteps on quiet nights, always behind you, but never in sight. Perhaps they're not trying to frighten us. Perhaps they're trying to remind us, never again. What's your theory about what really drove Brother Marcus to these unspeakable acts? Was it genuine religious delusion, or something darker hiding behind faith? Share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. If stories like this make you question what other dark secrets might be hiding in plain sight, you're not alone. Subscribe for more real-life mysteries that will make you look at the world differently. Because sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that really happened. The darkness has many more secrets to tell.